Good evening, and welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime, and a very special holiday special of the podcast. I'm Nancy Miller, and it's that time of year again. You can feel it in your fingers, you can feel it in your toes, you can feel it in your eyeballs. The searing, indelible image of Hugh Grant dancing to the Pointer Sisters. Yes, it's that time for the movie Love Actually. And it is Hugh Grant playing the Prime Minister who utters that movie's most essential theme, that if you know where to look for it, love actually is all around. What a wonderful, uplifting sentiment. But here at Dead Sleep, we live by a different credo. In the world of true crime, the place where you and I spend a lot of our time, the more you look for it, it's death. Death, actually. That's all around. And what I'm talking about is more than morbid fascination. It's existential fact. Take any item off of your shelf, any object in this whole wide world, and there will be a story, a point of conflict, the sordid history, the unsolved mystery, a battle for life and death, of good versus evil, all of it contained in an ordinary thing we see every day. That is, of course, if you know where to look for it. And that is what I'm here to do. For this episode of Dead Sleep, I'm trying out a new concept, that it might be a recurring thing that I'm calling Death Actually, where in each episode of Death Actually, I choose a random object and find a compelling and thoughtful true crime story lurking somewhere behind it. And the thing that inspired this idea for Death Actually is the story I'm going to tell tonight. It just so happened I was in a supermarket and I saw one of my favorite childhood treats, a Carvel ice cream cake. And I thought to myself, there's no way. There is no way that there's some true crime story with a Carvel ice cream cake. And then I looked into it, and lo and behold, there was a murder mystery. One you're going to hear about tonight in a story I'm calling The Cookie Puss Conspiracy. There's a cemetery in Hartlet, New York, just outside of Manhattan, that holds the body and souls of some of America's greatest artists, thinkers, and activists. James Baldwin, Malcolm X, Joan Crawford, Thelonious Monk, Diane Arbus. They're all interned there. Extraordinary figures in American history whose work engaged, challenged, entertained, and changed the status quo. But in the fall of 1990, joining those cultural luminaries was a humble ice cream man whose life work was simple: to make the world a sweeter place. His name was Tom Carvel, and he was the founder and owner of Carvel Ice Cream, once one of the biggest and most beloved ice cream franchises in the U.S. Nowadays, if you know Carvel ice cream, it's from the selection sold in your supermarket freezer, alongside countless others. But there was a time, especially if you grew up on the East Coast in the better part of the 1980s, where Tom Carvel himself was a celebrity. The world's least likely TV star who reached peak fame in his late 70s. He appeared alongside talk show legends like David Letterman and was celebrated by the likes of Howard Stern. Known not by his face, but by his gravelly, mucus-mottled voice in his own DIY commercials that were so cheap, but so sincere, they became instant hits, viral phenomenons that made him and his Carvel brand famous.
Carvel ice cream. Carvel premium quality.
And Tom was ahead of his time because decades before YouTube and TikTok, Tom Carvel would address the audience directly in an ad-libbed conversational style, which was counter to the polished, slick ads of the 1980s. He never appeared on camera, but his voice was so signature, it's worth listening to for one moment.
Summer is here, and your participating Carvel ice cream dealer is busy making fresh sherbet and ice cream combinations in a deluxe Sunday dinner.
And the ice cream cakes, as well as Tom Carvel, were the stars of the show. One of the most iconic of them all was a cake called Cookie Puss. If you grew up in the tri-state area of New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey, you don't need an introduction to Cookie Puss. But for anyone who wasn't around at that time or in that place, it's fair to say Cookie Puss was the first and maybe only ice cream cake, or any cake, that had an origin story. A story arc that was uncannily familiar to anyone who'd seen the big movie out at that time called E.T. the Extraterrestrial. The story of Cookie Puss is that he came from outer space. His original name was Celestial Person.
Out of this world, because I'm a celestial person, and I talk children's talk. And at Carvel,
But once he hit Earth, and I guess became actualized as an ice cream cake with chocolate crunchies in the middle, in the shape of a light bulb, Cookie Puss was iconic. One of Carvel's most iconic ice cream characters ever. Kids at the time also knew CP's counterpart, Fudgy the Whale. And it was a rite of passage back then, as a kid, when you slowly realized all of the characters in the Carvel multiverse, they were all kind of shaped exactly the same, just decorated differently. There was the original CP, there was the Irish-themed Cookie Opus for St. Patrick's Day, there was Tom the Turkey for Thanksgiving. There really was no holiday that didn't have an appropriate ice cream cake to go with. All the while, the ever-thrifty Tom Carvel ensuring that he could do it all with just one style of cake mold. This is just one small example of Tom Carvel as an innovator and a hard worker and a savvy businessman. He was also a control freak, but largely a benevolent one. Tom Carvel and his wife Agnes were known for being generous with charitable causes, particularly with children in need. This included their own niece, Pamela, who they treated like their own daughter. The Carvels never had children, but they paid for Pamela's education and kept her close in the family business. A business that Tom, later in life, would start to worry that there was someone in his company who was stealing from him. And that business, when he died, was worth a lot of money, which included a generous trust, a foundation that he and his wife Agnes, who was still alive at that time in 1990, had planned carefully to ensure that their millions and millions of dollars would largely go to charity. On October 21st, in 1990, when Tom Carvel was found dead in his home at the age of 84, it was determined, at least at that time, to have been natural causes, a cardiac event. almost immediately after his death, strange things started happening. And over time, niece Pamela would start to wonder if her uncle's death was part of a dark conspiracy, that the famed ice cream man hadn't died from natural causes, but at the hands of a cold-blooded killer. But who would want to murder the world's friendliest and most famous ice cream man? That question would become an obsession for Pamela, who would spend years trying to get to the bottom of what really happened to her uncle and the fate of Tom Carvel's vast fortune. And we'll trace how a bitter battle over someone's estate devolved into accusations of murder. Our story begins with a mystery. Saturday, October 20th, 1990, as 84-year-old Tom Carvel drove up from New York City to the family's tranquil spot in upstate New York. Tom should have been happy. He'd recently sold his Carvel ice cream empire, a business he started over 50 years ago with just $15. And he'd just turned it over to a massive global conglomerate based in Bahrain, a small island country in the Persian Gulf near Saudi Arabia and Qatar. He'd made that deal for around $80 million, which in today's money would be a nice and healthy $200 million. And the best part for Tom? That deal was just for the ice cream chain. It didn't include a sizable amount of real estate he still owned and leased as part of the Carvel franchise, a business that included at least 40 properties, along with a golf course that would continue to generate revenue in perpetuity. The mystery, to anyone outside of Tom's sphere, was this: why, with all the success that he'd achieved, was Carvel so unhappy? He appeared to have it all: a loving wife he'd been married to for over 50 years, who was his partner in life and in business. Tom and Agnes were both immigrants. Tom was born in Greece and Agnes in Scotland, both with families who'd moved to America with dreams of a better life. By all accounts, he and Agnes had far exceeded anyone's expectations. They lived a comfortable but modest life, which meant Tom and Agnes didn't have to worry about money ever in their lifetime. They had multi-millions of dollars. And yet for Tom, instead of bringing peace of mind, he appeared agitated and paranoid. Over the past several months, Tom Carvel said he'd noticed the top people around him acting differently, suspiciously. The two people he was most suspicious of were the two people who were once closest to him: his longtime lawyer and financial advisor, a guy named Robert Davis, who'd been with him since the late 60s. And then there was Tom Carvel's personal secretary, a woman who'd reported directly to Tom Carvel for 38 years. Her name was Mildred Arcadipane, who went by Millie. It seemed the recent sale of the Carvel business exposed the hidden financial, professional, and emotional tension and turmoil inside the Carvel empire. A sense that Millie and Robert had played Thomas and Agnes, deceiving them out of greed. Tom wasn't exactly clear what had happened, but he decided that on Saturday, in October, that come Monday morning, he was going to march into Carvel HQ and tell Robert and Millie their services were no longer needed. Robert and Millie were fired. Tom went to bed Saturday night, finally with the peace of mind of knowing he had a plan of attack. Instead, Tom was himself attacked by his own heavy heart. That Sunday morning, October 21st, Tom Carvel was found in bed, the victim of a fatal cardiac event. Which made sense. He was old, and Tom had a heart condition, one he took medication for. So nobody questioned it, at least not at that time. Agnes was, of course, devastated, but if there was any consolation for his widow, it was that Tom had planned strategically for what would happen to his money, estimated to be around $70 million after his death. Agnes was there, right there, next to Tom, on an important night in February of 1988, about 2 years before he died, when they stood side by side, signing what was called a mirror will. As the name suggests, a mirror will is when two spouses, or partners, craft their wills to be nearly identical in language and legal desires. In the case of Tom and Agnes, they both agreed, when they died, their lasting legacy would be giving their millions away to charity, not in one big splashy lump sum, but instead, they wanted to give smaller amounts to various local charities in the towns and cities where they'd had Carvel franchises. Part of this mirror will was also to ensure the surviving spouse was taken care of. In this case, it was Agnes, who was supposed to be a main beneficiary. If he died first, she'd receive all the income his estate generated, plus quarterly payouts from a trust fund. Then, once Agnes died, whatever was left would go to that fund. So they created the Thomas and Agnes Carvel Foundation, and ultimately, when both Tom and Agnes were gone, the rest of their fortune, millions of dollars, would end up at that foundation. And then those millions would be distributed, drop by drop, in small donations of thousands of dollars to various charities, local charities, that would directly impact the people who lived in those communities. So that was how it was supposed to play out, at least in the mind of Agnes, now a widow, that everything would go to her via that foundation, and she'd carry on her husband's legacy, including the Carvel charity, receiving a sizable sum until she died, and then everything would be funneled into that charity. But nothing turned out quite like Tom planned. Once he was dead, there were no fewer than 7 people, that's 7 co-executors, overseeing the estate. The more co-executors, the greater risk for conflict, and the greater risk for delays. And 2 of those executives were Robert and Millie. In fact, it was Robert, the lawyer, who steered Tom Carvel into this structure in the first place. And the end result was what would later be described as a feeding frenzy, with Millie and Robert accused of being the sharks, and Agnes the unsuspecting chum. The life that she'd built over 50 years, torn apart and devoured in a matter of weeks. It was December 1990, a few months after her uncle's death, when Pamela received a phone call. It was her Aunt Agnes, and she needed help. Pamela grew up in Queens, New York, but by then she was in her late 30s, early 40s, and spent most of her time abroad in London. In old newspaper articles, Pamela is described as statuesque, with a bohemian vibe, her blonde hair worn as a single braid down to her waist. The effect was like a groovy warrior princess, who was now called to her aunt's rescue. Earlier in 1990, Pamela's father, that's Tom's brother, had died. Then, just months later, her uncle, he was gone. So Pamela came back to New York and snapped into action, because Pamela was one of those 7 executors of the estate, which afforded her a deeper look into what was happening with her uncle's estate and why Agnes was suddenly feeling shut out. In that December of 1990, right around the holidays, she discovered what was described as an avalanche of shady transactions. It appeared her aunt's assets were being cannibalized by greedy and corrupt Carvel employees who, in a complicated series of maneuvers, found a way to block Agnes, the widow, from accessing her own money. At the center of it all were two people, the very two people Tom wanted to fire that Monday. That lawyer, Robert Davis, and his secretary, Millie. Pamela soon discovered a sinister series of events that took place soon after her uncle's death and behind her Aunt Agnes's back. And if what she discovered was true, the sheer audacity was shocking. When Agnes was busy attending her husband's wake, Robert, the lawyer, entered the Carvels' suburban New York home without Agnes's knowledge or permission. He was there to track down Tom's will. Robert apparently knew it was in the family safe, but he didn't have access to the safe. But he thought ahead, and he brought along a locksmith who cracked open the safe to get access to that will. Not long after, Pamela got wind that someone was at Carvel HQ shredding documents. Alarmed, Pamela rushed to the office to discover that Millie, Tom's loyal secretary, was feeding page after page of some mystery documents into a giant shredder, as other Carvel employees yelled at her to stop. But the steadfast and iron-fisted Millie only kept feeding the pages faster, until Pamela, who was the youngest person in the room by at least 20 years, pushed Millie aside and tore the electrical cord from the wall. And then, and only then, was the machine and the room suddenly silent. Pamela was still trying to figure out what was going on. What was it everyone was afraid of? What were they trying to hide? What were they fighting over? It appeared, despite Tom's best efforts, that his will, the one that outlined his wishes, couldn't be found. Had it gone missing? Pamela believed Millie and Robert's suspicious behavior implicated they'd done something to sabotage Tom's will. Pamela suspected this Carvel trust, the money that was supposed to go to Agnes, was being diverted to someone else's piggy bank. It was up to Pamela to do something. Over the next several years, Pamela, who said she was acting on behalf of her Aunt Agnes, would dedicate her life to uncovering what was going on. And she'd discover things about her uncle, about Millie the secretary. Millie was more than Tom's secretary. For the 38 years she'd worked for him, she appeared to be the company's most dedicated employee. Hired straight out of secretarial school, Millie made her career at Carvel her life. She never married or had children, never took vacation. Her coworkers recalled her only 2 days she'd ever taken off was back in the 1960s when her father died. Millie came from a traditional Italian family where women didn't have careers. If they had anything, they had designated vocations. A woman could either be a nurse or a teacher. We may not think much of the term now, but back then, to be a secretary, an executive secretary, for a powerful CEO of a successful company, that was a big deal. With an elevated financial and social status, most women, especially women Millie knew, they didn't enjoy. Where things appeared to get complicated was when things got personal between Millie and her boss. Millie and Tom were 20 years apart. She was in her 20s when she started working at Carvel. Tom was in his 40s. Neither one ever spelled it out, at least not publicly, but it was obvious that there was a dynamic between the two, a dynamic that suggested Millie and Tom had some kind of entanglement, and one that had left Tom vulnerable and empowered Millie. By the 1980s, after 30 years working for Tom, Millie pretty much ran the show. And she was notorious for treating her coworkers and her own boss with a kind of rudeness and disdain that can only mean that she had some kind of dirt, that she'd saved the receipts, and there was nothing Tom could do about it. One time, Millie locked Tom out of his own office as some kind of punishment. But instead of firing her, which many hoped he would, Tom bought Millie jewelry. A former employee of Carvel once recalled Tom mumbling that Millie had him over a barrel. What the gritty details were, who knew? But one thing was obvious. Millie's sense of entitlement after Tom's death appeared to be the behavior of someone out to settle a score or get her due, and maybe showing poor Agnes who was really the boss. It wasn't Tom. It wasn't Agnes. It was Millie. When he was alive, Tom Carvel was known as a fighter who refused to lose at all costs. His detractors, including the Federal Trade Commission, compared his business practices to the mafia, where you had to do it his way or else. He was accused of exploiting and controlling Carvel franchise operators, many of them immigrants, like Tom, prohibiting them from enjoying the very same American dream Tom had. Now in death, Tom's fight continued. And it was now Pamela who was going down swinging. By the mid-1990s, the battle over the Carvel estate was a full-on war, with little skirmishes taking place in courtrooms in various places from New York to Florida to Delaware, and now in London, where Pamela had moved with her aunt for her aunt's own mental and physical health. Once in London, Pamela sought to secure crucial funds for her aunt. All the while, the executors of the Carvel Trust argued over money, and they began to question whether or not Agnes, who was in her late 80s, was even fit to decide what to do with her money. They began accusing Pamela of manipulating her aunt for her own financial benefit. In 1998, at the age of 89, Agnes passed away. Her final years, nothing like she and her husband had imagined. Agnes deemed unworthy of her own fortune, while a lawyer and a secretary became millionaires. Even after death, Agnes couldn't rest. Her remains were kept frozen as Millie, Robert, and others involved with the Carvel Trust wanted an autopsy done to determine, once and for all, if Agnes's brain showed signs of cortical atrophy or other signs of dementia. Pamela was outraged, and she found a way to put a stop to it, cremating her aunt and ensuring Agnes was buried next to Tom back in New York. It was perhaps the one thing they'd wished for that had gone according to plan. But there was hope that maybe this whole thing could now be put to rest. Tom was dead, Agnes was dead. The money would go into that charitable trust and be distributed to various local charities and at least make a difference in that way. It would be bittersweet, but end of story. But it didn't end there. The battle over the Carvel fortune raged on, and the ensuing years were brutal to both sides. Pamela was there on behalf of her aunt and uncle and their legacy. Millie and Robert were on the other side. Pamela was determined to expose Millie and Robert for the scammers she knew them to be. And one early victory was the discovery that Robert and Millie had taken large sums from the trust. And in Millie's case, she used Carvel's charity money to fund private school tuitions for family members. It would turn out that they didn't actually need the money. They had plenty of money. But Millie wanted to show everyone who didn't give her credit, or the respect, or the love that she deserved, that she was a big shot. And when all of this was exposed, Robert and Millie were held accountable for roughly $1 million in missing funds in order to pay that money back. So Pamela succeeded in exposing them as scammers. But murderers? How could that be? Tom had a bad heart. The death certificate confirmed he died from cardiac arrest. And yet, when a private investigator hired by Pamela dug deeper into the incident, the investigator found out a few curious details about what happened the day her uncle died. A friend of Tom's, who was a guest at the house the week Tom died, told the investigator that just hours after Tom had been found dead, someone from the company, this man didn't know who it was just someone from Carvel, who called and told this friend to go into Tom's medicine cabinet and remove all of his medications. The friend of Tom said he complied, but he later admitted it left him with a strange feeling that something was off. This friend grew even more suspicious when Tom's body was whisked away to a funeral home within hours of his death. Pamela's private investigator also said that when he visited the doctor, the one whose signature was on Tom's death certificate, the doctor said he had no memory of examining Tom Carvel's body or of signing that certificate. These revelations felt like bombshells to Pamela, and for her, a murder plot emerged. That someone had poisoned Tom Carvel by tampering with his heart meds, then arranged somehow for Tom's body to be taken away quickly to a funeral home with a forged death certificate. Yes, it was all circumstantial evidence. But Pamela believed it was enough to get the police involved. And at one point, she was so convinced her uncle had been poisoned that she petitioned a court to allow his remains to be exhumed and forensically examined. But like most of Pamela's efforts, her quest for justice only led to another court request, another petition, another jurisdiction. It was life imitating Cookie Puss. Same exact mold, just decorated differently. And unlike Carvel cakes, people aren't frozen in time. Tom Carvel, of course, died in 1990. Agnes died in 1998. Millie died in 2002. Robert Davis, the lawyer, he also died soon after. By 2012, the only person connected to this case firsthand who was still alive was Pamela. And by that time, around 2010, she was barred from filing any more lawsuits, at least around this case. She did, however, file for bankruptcy. And ironically, after all the years she spent pushing her way into countless courtrooms, she failed to show up for one of her own really important court appointments, which led to a warrant being issued for Pamela's arrest. But Pamela, she went off the grid, disappeared, from the courts and from the news. When I checked recently, it appeared to me that she's still alive, in her 70s, and somewhere in New Jersey. But even if Pamela were still fighting for her family, there's very little actual Carvel fortune left. Decades spent in the courtroom drained millions and millions from that fund. The Carvel Foundation does exist, but it has no connection to anyone involved with the original Carvel company or the Carvel family. Whether Tom Carvel was murdered or not, I can't say. And what someone should do with their millions of dollars, I'll never know. But I do know this episode left me craving two things. To go and watch the 2005 miniseries, the BBC version of Charles Dickens' Bleak House. It is exactly this story. It was fiction when Charles Dickens wrote it in the 1850s. But you'll be surprised at how identical these stories are, from the murder mystery to the absurd intergenerational delay in money that belongs to families that get sucked up and subsumed by the courts. And then, of course, there's a second thing. While watching that, I'm going to recommend grabbing a fork and eating the shit out of a Fudgy the Whale cake, or a Cookie Puss cake, or a Cookie Opus, or a Tom Turkey. It doesn't matter, because it's all the same. But you know what will be different? There'll be an all-new episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime out in early January. So until then, happy holidays, happy New Year, and 99.
Fresh ice cream every day.